This video is sponsored by Another Eden, the cat beyond time and space. Stick around to learn more about their upcoming collaboration with Chrono Cross. It's been almost 25 years since Final Fantasy VII released in Japan, and with the next part of the Final Fantasy VII remake still being eagerly anticipated, the first Soldier having what appears to have been a successful launch, and Ever Crisis, we assume, being just around the corner, it's clear to see that the legacy of Final Fantasy VII is still very much with us. It's difficult to quantify how much of an impact Final Fantasy VII has had during that time, but one thing is for sure, even now, almost 25 years later, we, as fans, are still desperate to find out more about the game, and it's why we are very excited to share with you another edition of our Final Fantasy VII Facts series. As always, what we're going to run through today will be some pretty obscure facts that we've selected with the hopes of them being insightful on multiple levels beyond just the initial headline, because that continues to be important to us. We always want to provide value by going beyond what's expected by providing new perspectives on the wider story. That's why we won't be talking in more detail about pretty common facts like before Final Fantasy VII, Ketchi appeared as an Esper in Final Fantasy VI with an almost identical visual style, and that Tifa's hair was designed to mimic the appearance of a dolphin. What we're going to start off with instead is a lesser known fact about the involvement of one of the main composers working on Final Fantasy VII Remake and the role they had on the original Final Fantasy VII soundtrack. But before we do, here's a message from the sponsor of today's video, Another Eden, the cat beyond time and space. Another Eden was released a few years ago on mobile devices, and it was released earlier this year on Steam. At its helm is Masato Kato, who not only served as the story planner and scriptwriter on Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VII and Xenogears, but was also the director of Chrono Cross. And it's that last credit that's perhaps the most important, as Complex Dream, a crossover story with Chrono Cross, which has also been written by Kato, is now available for free within Another Eden. The event is available for anyone to enjoy with no time-based restrictions, and crossover characters are obtainable through natural progression as opposed to being locked out by gacha or paywall mechanics. It also contains hours worth of free content, including exclusive stories and features inspired by the crossover, as well as exclusive music overseen by the legendary Yasunori Mitsuda. If you've a hankering for some Chrono and want to support the channel, make sure to check out Another Eden by clicking on the link in the description below. Now, Final Fantasy VII was accompanied by an original soundtrack that was pretty spectacular. It featured a huge array of styles and instruments, and when linked with the various locations the player would visit, the characters they'd meet and the event sequences they'd view, it created something that was incredibly memorable. As had been the case with every prior game in the franchise, Nobuo Uematsu was central to this. In addition to composing every single theme heard throughout, Uematsu was responsible for rearranging them to suit the needs of the wider production team, and he also served as the producer of the entire score. But as expectations grew, so too did the volume of staff required to ensure the soundtrack delivered on those expectations. And this was because outside of its in-game utilization, Square had become more serious about the commoditization of the soundtracks, selling them as standalone products and even producing arrangement albums. To make sure production values were as good as they could be, as had been the case with some of the previous 16-bit soundtracks, Uematsu was assisted by a team that had grown over time to include a sound programmer, a sound engineer, a recording engineer, a team of individuals creating sound effects, and a mastering engineer. But for Final Fantasy VII, there was a desire to push production values even further. The initial plan was to use vocal performances in numerous pieces, something that Uematsu felt would make the soundtrack much more immersive. But after being unimpressed by the long load times, the pros did not outweigh the cons, and it led to Uematsu choosing to restrict the use of vocals to moments of significant importance. This led to the creation of the Sephiroth Choir, which would be used as a backdrop for One Winged Angel, and we presume for another track called Those Chosen by the Planet. According to the credits, the Sephiroth Choir contained 8 members with an even distribution between soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. And one of them, a relatively unknown musician at the time called Masashi Hamwazu, would end up making some pretty huge contributions as the franchise built out, serving as the main composer for much of the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, as well as being one of the principal composers on the Final Fantasy VII Remake. On Final Fantasy VII, Hamwazu was one of the two bass vocalists in the Sephiroth choir, but he also served as a synthesizer operator for the excerpt that was used from Hayden's The Creation. And what's also interesting is that as Hamwazu's stock grew and he was given more and more compositional responsibilities at Square, he then called upon other members of the Sephiroth choir to support his efforts, including one Matsue Fukushi. Fukushi appeared as one of the two soprano vocalists on Final Fantasy VII, and not long after the project was completed, the pair actually got married. She then returned to work as a vocalist on Final Fantasy VIII, known as Matsui Hamwazu for that particular work, and would end up working on numerous projects at Square and then Square Enix, including Sigma Harmonix and Final Fantasy XIII alongside her husband. But it wasn't just his wife that would return to work on other projects, as Daisuke Hara, one of the two tenors, also worked on Final Fantasy X and XI and was a performer during some of the first Distant World concerts, and the other tenor, Toru Tabe, worked on Final Fantasy VII, Unlimited Saga, Final Fantasy XIII and World of Final Fantasy as both a singer and a guitar player. Sticking with the soundtrack, it's not all that well known that when the PC version of Final Fantasy VII released in 1998, even though its soundtrack was the same on a compositional level, due to how it was delivered, it was not identical to the PlayStation version. Even though many other companies were recording CD quality music for their games, as we just covered in the previous fact, Uematsu was not comfortable doing so due to compromises that would need to be made with other aspects of the game. There was a belief that even though pre-recorded music would sound better, if they chose to use it, extra demands would be placed on the read access time of the CD-ROM. They believed this would lead to players having to wait for the CD-ROM to load data, something that would cause unnecessary stress as the transitions between field and battle would not be as seamless as they had been in the 16-bit era. The compromise was for Uematsu to use the PlayStation's internal sound chip, but doing so meant he would need to compose music, program it into a sequencer, and hope that when he played it back through the PlayStation's chip, it sounded close to what he had envisioned. By the end of development, after no doubt a ton of tweaking and fine-tuning, Uematsu was satisfied. The PlayStation sound bank had been used to great effect, and when necessary, pre-recorded music had been used in a few instances to enrich the experience. But Uematsu had never anticipated that the approach he'd taken would then need to be used elsewhere, and when work started on the PC version, the thoughtful and considered approach to using the PlayStation's internal sound chip would end up causing numerous problems in terms of how the music would be delivered. When working on the PlayStation version, Uematsu had been able to tailor his compositions to a single sound library, and he knew that as the game was a PlayStation exclusive, it would always sound the same when played. But the PC version did not have the same restrictions. There were a plethora of sound cards on the market, and they each came with their own library of sound fonts. It presented something of a dilemma to IDOS, who were working on the PC version. But despite there being the potential for every track to sound very different depending on a player's setup, they still chose to use the onboard sound cards to deliver music, as opposed to using pre-rendered tracks. This meant that unlike the PlayStation version, where everyone received the same experience, PC players had anything but parity. And perhaps one of the most frustrating aspects was that some players would even have the few pre-rendered tracks that did exist removed based on nothing more than the hardware they were running the game on. It meant that the Sephiroth choir may not have even been heard by people playing Final Fantasy VII on the PC, something that I can personally attest to, having played Final Fantasy VII on PC and being very confused when people at my school started talking about how awesome the choir sounded in One Winged Angel. All I heard instead was a manufactured choir sound. It wasn't all doom and gloom though. IDOS presented players with a few different options, including specific settings for AWE sound cards and the soft synthesizer SXG70, which was claimed at the time to allow anyone with a PC to enjoy, quote, music playback with CD quality sound even on PCs without a sound card. Those with the know-how could have used these settings to amp up everything by using custom sound fonts and setups, and meant that if players had access to the right equipment, there were some aspects of the original soundtrack that would have sounded much better on PC when compared to the PlayStation version. If you're interested in hearing some of the differences, I'd recommend listening to this upload by Niltwill, as it shows the Final Fantasy VII original soundtrack being played on a Yamaha MU-90. There's a link in the description below. Now, there have been numerous details released over the years about how much of a development nightmare it was for Eidos to work on the PC version of Final Fantasy VII, outside of course of figuring out how to deliver the soundtrack. After the deal had been signed with Square, instead of handing over the source code for the completed PlayStation version that could be used as a base, they were only able to grant employees at Eidos access to an earlier build of the game. And due to there being essentially 5 different game engines powering Final Fantasy VII, and much of it being custom coded to work exclusively with the PlayStation architecture, it's estimated that around 80% of the game had to be rewritten from scratch just to make it work on the PC. It's why there are so many discrepancies that exist between the two versions. And one of the more prominent examples is that even though characters have the same core features and are clearly identifiable, they also look quite different. This was emphasized by Cloud and other prominent characters having mouths in the PC version, but not in the PlayStation version, as the developers had chosen to take them out just before the game launched. There are also numerous technical oddities, such as the battle scene running at 15 frames per second on PC, as opposed to 60 frames per second, and FMV sequences being downscaled. Perhaps because of everything that happened, even though the PC version of Final Fantasy VII released in North America and Europe, Square chose not to release it in Japan, and this was even stated as an active decision during a press announcement from Yamaha where they talked about licensing their XG soft synthesizer. It's never been revealed why Square purposely chose not to release the PC version of Final Fantasy VII in Japan, although it's rumoured to have been because there was a serious regression in the once bustling scene for PC games in that region. But either way, it meant that Japanese gamers would have to wait just under 15 years to be able to play Final Fantasy VII on a PC, something that was probably not helped by Square losing the source code of the original PC version. As revealed by the former president of Eidos, Keith Boesky, when speaking to Polygon, many years after leaving Eidos, he received a call from Square Enix. They stated their intentions to re-release the PC version, but they had lost access to the Gold Master and were wondering if he happened to know where it was. Final Fantasy VII was eventually re-released by Square on the 14th of August 2012 as a digital product, and it could be purchased via their North American and European online stores, but there was still no Japanese release. That wouldn't come until almost a year later, when the game was released on the Japanese Square Enix store as Final Fantasy VII International, due to it housing a ton of extra content that the North American and European digital version did not contain. This content would then be added to the Western version to create a new combined package when Final Fantasy VII was released on Steam. Moving away from the production side to focus on gameplay elements, we're now going to dive into something that made Holy quite unique in Final Fantasy VII, outside of it having a huge role within the game's plot. Holy was introduced in the original Final Fantasy as one of the level 8 ultimate white magic spells alongside Full Life, Null All, and Dispel, and it appeared in a similar fashion with every subsequent release, including Mystic Quest, as Holy was classified as one of the most powerful and exclusive spells available to white mages. In fact, the only exception to this was Final Fantasy VI, where due to the removal of magic schools and the introduction of new spells like Flood, Meltdown, and Gravajar, its relative power was downgraded. The other common detail was that outside of Japan, Holy always had its name changed to avoid any issues with regulators. It meant that over the years, Holy became known as Fade, White, and even Pearl, but after numerous Western releases, Final Fantasy VII became the first game to remove this censorship, with the game referring to Holy as Holy. But the interesting fact is that even though this was the first time the name was restored to being consistent with the Japanese release, Final Fantasy VII also represented the first time that Holy was not accessible for the player to use in combat. This was no doubt a conscious decision, as within the context of the game, Holy was associated with the white materia, and this led to it gaining a huge amount of significance due to Aerith and the spell's wider role in attempting to stop Meteor from destroying the planet. Having it available for players to use would have diminished its impact, and for that reason, a similar approach was taken with Meteor, which was also not usable for the first time since its original inclusion in Final Fantasy III. What's interesting is that the developers did still choose to provide alternatives for players to wield in combat. Comet was a pretty much like-for-like replacement for Meteor, and on the white magic side there was Ultima. Not quite a like-for-like, but in prior games it had sometimes been classified as a white magic spell on the same level as Holy. Alongside this significant change to how Holy and Meteor would appear in Final Fantasy VII, the developers also chose to make plenty of other tweaks to how magic could be used in general, and one of the interesting beneficiaries of this was the Earth element. Up until Final Fantasy VII, even though Earth was positioned as one of the major elements, something denoted by there being an Earth crystal in Final Fantasy I, III, IV, and V, Throughout much of the 8-bit and 16-bit era, its actual role in gameplay was quite diminished. Fire, lightning, ice, and even the wind element were often given priority, receiving numerous associated spells, summons, imbued weapons and armor, as well as enemies that could use attacks based on those elements. And it meant that Earth, outside of Final Fantasy V, where it did receive an increased focus due to the elemental alignments of Galuf and Krill, as well as the Geomancer job, was often reduced to being focused around Quake, Titan, and a handful of enemy attacks like Earthquake. Final Fantasy VII was rather different, and in the basic sense, this was due to the inclusion of the Earth materia. Based on previous iterations, it would have been much easier for the developers to include Quake as a standalone materia like Ultima, or as part of a collective materia like Destruct or Contain, but they instead chose to have Earth feature as its own piece of materia, and this led to the inclusion of not just Quake, but also Quake 2 and Quake 3. This represented the first time there had ever been more than one tier of Earth magic available to the player in the franchise, and with Yuffie also having her landscape limit break aligned with the Earth element, and there being a significant increase in the volume of enemies and attacks that could inflict Earth elemental damage on the player, it was a noticeable shift. What's interesting is that outside of the MMOs, after Final Fantasy VII, the Earth element returned to its typical diminished state, with almost none of the main number games offering anything other than Quake and Titan, and with some, like Final Fantasy IX, offering neither. Going back to the game's development, it's difficult to overstate how mad and insane it was. Between 1994 and 1996, there was just so much that changed behind the scenes on the project. It went from being a quick successor to Final Fantasy VI that was meant to release on the Super Famicom to being positioned as a must-have system seller for the PlayStation. And not only that, it would have to make use of huge graphical innovations and needed to be produced within just 1 year. As the game's sole director, Yoshinori Kitase had to think fast and adapt to what would have been a very unfamiliar staffing situation. And that didn't just apply to his own personal experiences, where he was directing a game for the first time on his own, but it would have also applied to his contemporaries and pretty much everyone else working in the video games industry at that time on a global scale. And that was because nobody had ever worked on a project of such scale and magnitude. To put things into perspective, the first Final Fantasy that Kitase had worked on, Final Fantasy V, only had 32 credited roles. They were split into management, planning, programming, design, and quality assurance, with a heavy focus on design and programming. Final Fantasy VI, which was co-directed by Kitase and Ito, was structured in much the same way, with the number of credited roles increasing to 53, and most of the increase in personnel being due to an increased focus on design. But due to everything that was expected of Final Fantasy VII, even though development had started off with the same structure, due to the sheer scale, there was an appreciation that it just wouldn't work. As a result, Kitase and Sakaguchi, who was acting as producer, formed an expansive leadership team. It would be comprised of numerous senior figures that included, but was not limited to, 13 individual directors overseeing various aspects of planning and design, 5 senior programmers, and 2 project managers whose sole responsibility was overseeing the work of contractors. Individual aspects of development were then split off into specific teams, with the field section containing 35 staff members, the battle section containing 21, and another 34 being assigned to CG. There were also smaller teams then set up to oversee the production of any minigames like Fort Condor, Chocobo Racing, and the snowboarding segment. It meant that Kitase now had specific teams that were larger than the entire development staff that worked on Final Fantasy V, and that was when only thinking about staff members who were employed by Square. On top of this, hundreds of contractors contributed to the project in meaningful ways, with a company called Kusanagi providing vast arrays of concept art for the various locations, and 9 different companies helping out with CG. And one of the interesting facts here is that one of those 9 companies, Toze, would end up becoming a major partner for Square Enix in the years to come. Not only did they oversee ports of the 8 and 16-bit era games over to the Game Boy Advance, they also worked on Final Fantasy Tactics War of the Lions and co-developed Lightning Returns and World of Final Fantasy. By the end of Final Fantasy VII's development, when including all of these contractors, it meant that over 250 different staff members had contributed to the development of Final Fantasy VII at one point or another, and many of them had never even worked on a Final Fantasy game before. It really puts the success of Final Fantasy VII into perspective, as not only was this an unprecedented occurrence in the video games industry on a global scale, but it was one of the major factors in Final Fantasy VII costing approximately $40 to $45 million to make. And that brings us on to our final fact, which relates to the 4th disc of Final Fantasy VII. There have been rumours rumbling around for years about a so-called fourth disc of Final Fantasy VII, and many of these related to stories that Aerith could be revived. But in Japan, there actually was a fourth disc that accompanied Final Fantasy VII, although it wasn't quite what you'd expect. And to explain, we need to take a trip down memory lane. Back when Final Fantasy IV released on the Famicom, Square decided to re-release the game not too long after with the new name of Final Fantasy IV Easy Type. It contained numerous bug fixes, balancing to make the game a lot more forgiving, some general gameplay improvements, and a more simplified script, and this was then used as a base for the North American release. Square chose not to use a similar approach for Final Fantasy VI, but following the release of Final Fantasy VII, they chose to re-release the game 10 months after, and it would be called Final Fantasy VII International. This name was chosen to reflect to the Japanese public that it would contain improvements from the North American release, including the addition of Ruby and Emerald weapon. But alongside this, Square also chose to create a fourth disc that would contain a whole host of extra content that would be exclusive to the region. This fourth disc contained a treasure trove of information related to the world and the various locations the player could visit, as well as characters, weapons, material and accessories they could equip. Even the many items that could be found throughout the traditional playthrough featured as part of this collection, and they were accompanied by lots of extra details and some wonderful concept art. On top of this, it would also be possible to play limit break animations and summons, and there was a whole section dedicated to the making of, which contained a bucket load of concept art, which included a variety of logo concepts and also a short movie that featured work in progress footage from various stages of the game's development. Final Fantasy VII International did manage to sell almost 500,000 copies when it was released in Japan, but this disc is now very rare, especially in Western territories, and not many people know of its existence as a result. And with that, I think we're done. They were 7 facts about Final Fantasy VII that we are pretty confident that you still didn't know, and as always we threw in a load of little bonus facts for good measure. Having said that, we're pretty sure there are still some amongst you who knew all of them, but let us know in the comments below which you found to be the most interesting, and of course, if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Also, make sure you check out the Kickstarter campaign for The Legacy of the Crystal, an encyclopedic book that we're writing to chronicle every major Final Fantasy game released between 1987 and 2021. That, thanks to your support, has now been expanded to also cover the Bravely series. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in, there's a link in the description below, but don't wait too long because the campaign is just about to end. Alright guys, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, Anthony Hoffman and Gregory, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.